Interviewers are absolutely critical to the success of BSA. There's the whole thing about persuading people on the doorstep to take part. It's important that the sample is representative. That's part of the credibility of the study. So getting across to that person you're trying to persuade that they are important and they can't be substituted, really important. Is often we're piloting new questions, so interviewers are very important in telling us how they've been working so that the final question really gets at what we want it to do in a good way. So we can't do it without interviewers. We initiated British Social Attitudes back in 1983, and one of the fantastic things about that is that we set the terms for publicity, so we can pretty much guarantee that we will get a big splash each year because we own the copyright. So I've been on the Today programme a couple of times, on the BBC News channel, lots of local radio interviews, and I always find there's something in BSA if I'm doing a presentation that I can draw on. One of the really interesting findings, if you look back to 1983, is the declining trust in politicians that we've seen, which has really sort of concerned a lot of people. We're a democracy, it's really important that people turn out to vote and so on, and we've seen a decline in the percentage of people who think that it's everybody's duty to vote. And this really has been part of the problem in terms of our lack of trust in politicians. We're more likely to think they're not going to be telling the truth if they're in a tight corner and so on. So it's definitely something politicians have been fantastically concerned about.
Well, the British Social Attitude Survey is the gold standard, I think, in terms of these sorts of surveys. I mean, one of the crucial aspects is the fact that it's face-to-face. I mean, there are plenty of surveys done, commercial surveys, often use telephones, or they do it online, or they use just forms, people filling in forms. I mean, the BSA is a big survey. There are lots and lots of questions. Some of them can be quite complex, but actually that's its usefulness. We can ask not just yes-no questions, we can ask questions which actually trying to really get at what people think and feel.
And the Prime Minister will be aware of the latest British Social Attitude Survey showing a record fall in public satisfaction with the NHS.
Policymakers need to take account of the findings and results of the British Social Attitude Survey around the health and healthcare, particularly, as we do, in fact. I mean, we are a think tank, we are policy critics in the best sense of the word. The public, the patients, are the key stakeholder in the system. We do care about what doctors and nurses think, of course, and managers and so on, but in the end, it's about patients and the public. Understanding how satisfied they are or not with the NHS, and how that changes over time is absolutely vital. In the end, that's why the NHS exists. It exists to provide a service to the public. So understanding what the public feel and think and their attitudes towards the NHS is absolutely vital.
The data that is gathered by the NatSen interviewers is absolutely crucial to the work that I do, the work that obviously my colleagues on other newspapers who write in similar fields do, and you know, absolutely crucially to policymakers and ministers themselves. The story sparked by the BSA findings, which for me was incredibly important, was the discovery in the 2012 data that attitudes towards welfare benefit claimants had significantly hardened, and that this was a change which had endured basically since 1995. What we, as journalists were able to discern was that in past recessions, attitudes towards welfare claimants had generally softened, but in this current recession, they'd actually hardened. There's been a growing frustration with people on benefits, and the NatSen data, just brilliantly explained why that is the case.
Policymakers should listen to survey results because they're going to give them a good idea as to whether or not a policy is actually going to work or not, and whether or not it's actually going to be acceptable to public opinion. It's much more difficult to get a policy to work if the public are against it than they are in favour of it. And I guess one obvious example where in a sense we can show from survey work that politicians did change policy at the right time and go with the changing grain of public opinion was the introduction of civil partnerships for same-sex couples. That policy change occurred following a fairly dramatic change of attitudes towards being much more acceptable of same-sex relationships, and as a result that policy was timed to perfection so far as public opinion is concerned. It had been a few years earlier, there would still have been a lot of opposition. A few years later, and it would have been behind the times.